Alright, this is segment 2 for personality development, and we're looking into Freud's defense mechanisms, and we've gone through the list to the point of now looking at identification. And this is the taking of attributes of another person and making them part of oneself. So in order to deal with the stress that you have within yourself that's being held down, you will sort of identify with someone else and maybe dress the way they do, act the way they do, speak the way they do. It's called identification, and Freud believed it was very much a defense mechanism, again, denying or distorting the reality of what you really are. But remember, all defense mechanisms, again, are subconscious, so you don't know you're doing them. Now, sublimation, we actually talked about earlier. It's the idea of displacement, but when it serves a higher cultural or socially useful purpose, as in the creation of art or inventions, that's called sublimation. Freud himself thought that for the sake of civilization and survival, the energies which are held within us could and should be displaced or sublimated into socially appropriate or constructive forms. And this last one's a very interesting one because you probably have thought through this at some point, but maybe not known exactly what it was called. It's called reaction formation, and this is the idea that someone is actually has a deep-seated like of something or connection to something, desire for something, and yet they will act as though they are the total opposite, that they don't care, that they're not interested in it, or whatever it might be. So your friend may tell you that they're not interested in a particular guy, but every time she sees him, she says something about him, she's always talking about him, and you'll eventually say, boy, you talk about that guy a lot. And the reality is that Freud would argue that that's reaction formation. Underneath it all, the person has great interest in that guy and yet acts like they don't. Now, the extension of this is when people seem to crusade against something. So somebody who's actually likes alcohol would crusade against it, or something along those lines. And that's where we get the Shakespearean line of methinks they doth protest too much, overdoing the opposite. So these are some of the defense mechanisms. There are more, but you can watch for these in yourself and others. And remember that when people do these, it's not necessarily negative. We do it to relieve that stress or tension that Freud is talking about. But if you overdo them, of course, like anything else, it can be negative. Okay, Freud's developmental stages, or how Freud actually believes that your personality is developed. Freud maintained that personality develops in a series of 5 stages. He called these stages psychosexual because he believed the psychological development that occurs depends on the changing expression of energy in different parts of the body as the child matures. Now, the 5 stages you see there: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. And the ideas behind these are that if you go through these stages and you don't get them through them correctly, in other words, for instance, in the oral stage, too much or too little gratification can result in specific behaviors. The second stage, of course, too much or too little, again, making you a type A person or a very messy person, and so forth. We'll talk about the details of this when we get into class so we can look at them in a more extensive way. So let's take a look now beyond Freud's theories and take a look at some of what are called the Neo-Freudians. Now, this is Carl Jung, and that's the way you pronounce it. And his version of Freud's theories is called Jung's analytical psychology. Jung was a contemporary of Freud. Like Freud, he emphasized the unconscious influence on personality. He saw the unconscious with 2 layers: the personal unconscious, which is material not in your conscious awareness because it has been repressed or forgotten, and then the collective unconscious, a storehouse of latent memories inherited from the ancestral past of humans. Each person shares the collective unconscious of all humans. These ancestral memories are called archetypes. Definition of an archetype is an emotionally charged image or thought form that has a universal meaning. Archetypes show up in dreams, and some examples, of course. The shadow represents the chaos and wildness of our character. Something called the anima, which is the male, and the animus, which is the female. The self, which is you and God. And so those are some of the archetypes that he actually talks about. Actually, archetypes have more influence on philosophy and religion than they do on psychology, but it does give you a little taste of what Jung is actually basing his theories on. Jung's work is more well known for his description of introversion and extroversion. Introverted or inner-directed behavior and extroverted or outer-directed personality types. Introverts are preoccupied with the internal world of their own thoughts, feelings, and experiences. They tend to be more contemplative and aloof. And extroverts tend to be more focused on the external world, and they tend to be outgoing, talkative, and friendly. So Jung believes that, again, it's unconscious forces that make you this way, but his big contribution was the description of these two different types of personality. Now, the next theorist we'll talk about is Alfred Adler. He's also a Neo-Freudian, and both Jung and Adler sat around and talked with Freud all the time, and that's how they came up with their ideas. Adler's also Neo-Freudian. He broke from Freud with a group of psychoanalytic theorists who believed that some of Freud's ideas were a little bit too outside the norm, and their new approach was called individual psychology. Like Jung, Adler argued that Freud had gone overboard in centering his theory on sexual conflicts, as I just mentioned. Adler saw that the foremost cause of human motivation was a striving for superiority, but this superiority is more sinister than, say, the self-actualization that Maslow will talk about later. According to Adler, superiority was a universal drive to adapt, improve oneself, and master life's challenges. But again, a little bit more sinister than what Maslow had said. Adler also believed that childhood feelings of weakness and helplessness are overcome in adulthood when you gain new skills and talents. Now, this striving is the main motivation of humans, not a motivation for physical gratification, as Freud had claimed. Adler asserted that each person has to work to overcome some feelings of inferiority that build up along the way. So when you're a child, obviously you feel inferior to adults, and so how you do this is through compensation. Compensation is defined as efforts to overcome imagined or real inferiorities by developing one's own abilities. Adler saw compensation as normal, but in some people inferiority can become overwhelming. This results in the inferiority complex that you perhaps have heard of at some point. This is an exaggerated feeling of weakness or inadequacy. So why does this happen, or how does it occur? Adler believed that either parental spoiling or parental neglect could cause an inferiority complex. This is an idea he had in common with Freud. Excessive inferiority feelings can cause something called overcompensation. So if you really feel inferior, you overdo it trying to go the other direction, and you do so to conceal the feelings that you have. Some people lose their course and spend their efforts trying to make up for and to hide from reality by being caught up in appearances. So Adler would say this is a great example of overcompensation. So this would be the person who seems to be overly concerned about how they appear to others. Now, we saw some of that in development with adolescents, but this is something that continues on throughout their entire lifetime. And so Adler would say there was something going on as far as the way the parents raised you. Adler also focused on the idea of birth order. We'll talk about it in class, but he argues it's a huge factor in personality. And although it's anecdotally logical that birth order might affect your personality, there's never been any real support found in most studies for the idea that there's one specific personality type based on a particular birth order. Everybody has their stereotypes of what it might be. But actually they have found some support for the idea that the firstborn tends to be conventional and achievement-oriented, while later-borns tend to be more liberal and rebellious. Other influences on personality that relate to the family structure include the age split between children. That could have an effect, and the age split between the parents and the children. If the older parents and younger children, you can have a different dynamic. Obviously, there's gender differences that affect birth order. The relationship with the parents, and we talked about that before, it's actually a two-way street. And then, of course, the number of children in the family could actually have a huge impact on birth order. We'll talk more about birth order again in class. And our final theorist, as you see here on the right, is a woman who would be a very unusual character to find in the early history of psychology, but she definitely made a big impression. Karen Horney, who talked a little bit about something called womb envy instead of the other envy, which supposedly, according to Freud, women have of the influence and power of men. Her argument is that there is a huge impact on the personality development of males who actually envy the fact that women can create something while men aren't actually able to do so. So it's a very interesting flip of the idea that Freud has that we'll talk about in class. So let's evaluate the psychodynamic theories. There are many grand theories. Here are some things about the theories that actually ring true. Unconscious forces can influence us. Internal conflict can create psychological distress, and early childhood experiences can have a strong influence on adult personality. People do use defense mechanisms, there's no question there. Some criticisms, well, it's very difficult to test. In fact, Freud did most of this by just kind of guessing, talking to other people and listening to his patients. Two, inadequate evidence, again, same basic idea, and of course the very strong male-dominated view of Freudian psychology in general. But Freud was undoubtedly an innovator. Now, interestingly, one of the people who kind of makes Freud more popular is, of all people, his daughter, who first survived being raised by Freud, and then secondly became a very fine and well-respected psychoanalyst on her own. And what she did was basically take Freud's theories and sort of tidy them up and kind of smooth out the edges and some of the terminology that he used to make it more palatable for the general public. All right, let's move on to our next theorist, and those are the behaviorists. And there should not be much about this theory or these theories that's any kind of a surprise to you. This statement by Skinner that you see up there, "Give me a child and I'll shape him into anything," is a really good example of what Skinner really brought forward and what the behaviorists really believe. So again, environment is a key factor. Personality is predictable from your own history of reinforcement, and punishment you could throw in there too. There's no mystical id, ego, and superego, and that was one of the criticisms definitely of Freud's theory, was that nobody could figure out where they were located, and Freud couldn't tell you anyway. The patterns of behavior that people have are influenced by the patterns of reinforcement that they've received. There's no specific stages of development according to Skinner. You just continue to pick up this stuff over your lifetime. Now, interestingly, he took his ideas and wrote a very interesting fiction book called Walden 2, and you can see the image of it over here on the right. And this was his argument through the medium of fiction for using behaviorist principles to affect human behavior. He believed that government could use these principles to control personality for the good of all mankind, and just thinking of that can probably make many people a little bit uneasy, because the idea of the government telling you or creating a certain personality would be an interesting idea, but then again, it's part of much of the science fiction realm, so it's an interesting notion. But Skinner's idea was not to control people to be used by the government or anything like that, but hopefully to make them better people. Bandura is a behaviorist, and his view was a little bit more nuanced than Skinner. His argument was personality is learned through personally experienced and observed reinforcement. So his big addition there is that you don't actually have to live through it yourself. He added the effect of inherited traits and then called it social cognitive theory. So the social side influences us. And then of cognition, of course, which Bandura was a big fan of, the idea of the patterns of thought that you pick up from your environment, either through personal experience or through social experience. And finally, the humanist, who we've talked quite a bit about in class, striving for self-actualization creates your personality. The key here, which is interesting, is that Carl Rogers, who was, other than Maslow, probably the most well-known humanist, argued that you should raise children with positive self-regard, and this meant, in a sense, don't punish them, but instead, if you have to give them a negative response, then you would withhold the positive regard or support for them. And his view was that if you use punishment, you're really destroying their personality development rather than helping them to build it and realize that they control everything that they do. We'll pick up with more on the humanist and finish up personality in our next segment.